Recording this video using Zoom, I want to make a few observations on recognizing arguments and distinguishing them from explanations. Usually, not always, but usually, something that looks like an argument but is not is probably going to be an explanation. Not in every case. I might mention one exception. A pep talk might sometimes look like an argument without being an argument. Say, well, at the time I'm recording this video, it's June 2020. By the time this video airs, this will seem terribly outdated. But say Donald Trump or Joe Biden is giving a speech to his supporters, and he says, I should be president and not that other guy, because blah, 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 and then he lists the reason the other guy should not be president, or the reasons he should be president, or both. But he's talking to his supporters who already agree that he's the one who should be president. So in this case, I think we have a pep talk. We might have words like because, and this might appear to be a premise indicator. It might appear to be premise and conclusion, and there might even be statements that support another statement. But here we're talking to people who don't need to be persuaded. And in this context, I think what we have is a pep talk and not necessarily an argument, at least to those supporters. Things get complicated because, maybe he's talking on camera and he's talking to his supporters, and for them it's a pep talk, but it's also an argument for the unpersuaded who might be watching on television or something. These things get complicated. But the general idea is this. Logic is the study of strategies by which we evaluate arguments to see if the premises provide good support for the conclusion. And in order to do that, you have to be able to identify the premise. Well, the premises, usually there's more than one. Identify the premises, be able to identify the conclusion, and identify whether there's an argument there in the first place. So the first step to evaluating an argument is to recognize it and to be able to identify the premises and conclusion. I believe in a different video I've gone over conclusion indicators and premise indicators. Those are very useful. But sometimes the passage you're dealing with, the text you're reading, the paragraph or so, maybe more than a paragraph of some text you're reading, newspaper, book, or whatever, that might have an argument, or the section of the video. These days, especially, an argument might be on YouTube. So passage might not be the right word. It might imply a written text. The meaning of the passage you're reading or the video you're watching or whatever is crucial. The most important thing to do to identify an argument, identify the premise, identify the premises, identify the conclusion is see if there's a proposition supported by all the others. That would be the conclusion, or maybe not. The final test ultimately is the context, and particularly whether you have good reason to believe that the person making these claims is trying to persuade. If so, it's an argument. If not, it's not an argument. Usually, it's an explanation. Now, a pep talk might sometimes look like an argument and not be an argument, but usually I think an explanation is what is going to be not an argument, but looking like an argument. And in fact, the pep talk example I'm giving you also seems to be an explanation. So it's not an exception. It's just there's something else sometimes that might look like an argument and not be an argument. Not just explanations, but pep talks, and there are probably other examples that I don't have in my head right now. I think I've talked about them in class before, though. An explanation is usually going to be that which looks like an argument and is not. How do you know the difference? Well, context. Premise indicators and conclusion indicators help, but meaning of the text matters, or meaning of the words on the video, or whatever, and the context matters a lot. Keep in mind, there are other things. I have a different video, I believe, talking about enthymemes. So watch out for the unstated conclusions or unstated premises. Be prepared to fill them in. Actually, I think it's going to be the next video in this series. In this video, we need to say just a little bit about this other thing you don't want to get tripped. Not every proposition Not every premise, not every conclusion is given in the declarative form. A rhetorical question, an exclamation, or a command may contain the conclusion of an argument. Here in this example, become a philosopher is given in the imperative mood. This is given as a command. This is given not as a declarative sentence, but I think it should be interpreted as a conclusion. And if you're going to test the argument for seeing whether the premises provide good support for the conclusion, you must be prepared to rephrase. Put it in the declarative mood if you can, or if not, the right sort of subjunctive mood sentence. And also, as a preview to the sort of thing we're likely to do a lot of later in this series, be prepared to organize the things a little more carefully. Something like this: P1 for premise 1, P2 for premise 2, C for conclusion, philosophy makes us wise, it is good to be wise, therefore you should become a philosopher. Or maybe this phrasing would be a little clearer. For you to become a philosopher would be good. Maybe something like that. I like the other one better. Keep it at that. So be prepared to find rhetorical questions or commands that are actually statements in an argument, a premise or a conclusion, but might not look like them. Lisa Simpson on The Simpsons one time said something like, "Can there be any doubt that global warming is the result of human activity?" Well, this is phrased as a question, but it's a rhetorical question. It was, in fact, I believe it was the premise to an argument she was giving. And the premise was either that global warming is the result of human activity, or it was that there can no longer be any reasonable doubt that global warming is the result of human activity. But she presented it in the form of a question. Well, there are legitimate rhetorical reasons to put statements in question form sometimes. Be prepared to deal with them accordingly. Be prepared to rephrase. So keep in mind all these things: conclusion indicators, premise indicators, the meaning of a passage, the context of a passage. Try not to get tripped up by statements not presented by statements presented in rhetorical rather than logical form, if that's the right way to phrase it. I think I like that. A rhetorical question is not presented in a strictly logical form. That's okay. Just don't get confused by it. Watch out for enthymemes. There'll be another video on that. Now, what do we do with arguments and non-arguments? Now, I realize that I've not prepared my notes for you. In a particular logic course, probably where I was using Copy's textbook, we had page 19 and some homework on page 19. Let me just pause for a moment and straighten out my notes. All right, I've made my notes appropriate now to this YouTube context and not to lesson plans for a course. So I'm dealing with a particular homework assignment in the logic textbook. In order to recognize an argument and distinguish an argument from an explanation, know that explanations sometimes look like arguments, don't get confused by premise indicators, and there are 3 strategies, 3 rules of thumb that will help you to distinguish between arguments and non-arguments. And a lot of this is review of what I've already said on this video. I'm just making it a little more systematic or summarizing it. Is there a proposition supported by the others? If so, it's the conclusion, assuming there's an argument. Is that thing you think might be the conclusion already accepted by the audience? And is the person you think is making the argument, or think might be making the argument, trying to persuade? If that person is not trying to persuade, this is not an argument. It's almost certainly an explanation. Here's a flow chart that goes over some of this, most of it. Ask if the author of the passage or the speaker on the YouTube video or whatever is trying to persuade us of something. If not, this is not an argument. It's probably an explanation. And it helps to make sure you know what's going on in the passage. Identify two things, the explanation and that which is explained, that which does the explaining and that which is being explained. Identify those things and then stop, that's all. Unless you're dealing with a homework assignment in a logic textbook because you're watching this video for a logic class, studying for a logic class in your dorm room or something. If that's the case, follow the instructions on the homework. They might give you more requirements than on this flowchart. For most of us, identifying the explanation and that which is explained is enough. Is the author of the passage trying to persuade us? If so, then this is an argument. And the next thing you should do is identify the conclusion and identify the premises. Now, that's where you stop with respect to distinguishing arguments from non-arguments and certain homework assignments in logic textbooks, perhaps. But for everything else in logic, that's where the fun begins. And this is all just preparation for getting to the actual application of what you learn in a logic class. Identify that there's an argument here. Yes, there's a person trying to persuade his or her audience of something, and here are the premises, here's the conclusion, and then the fun starts. Then you get to evaluate the premises, evaluate the relationship of the premises and conclusion to see if the premises do a good job supporting the conclusion, which is the point of logic.